Welcome to the Raw Coding YouTube channel. My name is Anton, and today I'm going to show you why ChatGPT is not discontinuing developers just yet. So you can put that spatula away. You're not flipping burgers just yet. You can relax. As much of as doomsday news people would like this to be, it's not. I'm going to be trying to implement 2 examples, and the summary for this is pretty much you still need a developer to input commands into ChatGPT for it to generate meaningful things. Same as in the real world. If a person comes to you and asks, I want this painting to be drawn, an artist has to go back and be like, what do you actually want? And then start prompting for details. We, as developers, do exactly the same. A person says a thing and then I have to keep prompting for details and be able to estimate where I draw that line, where I have enough details for an implementation that I can deliver and then I can iterate on. ChatGPT has never prompted me for more details. I basically have to come up with that detail. The reality is you still need programmers to know what is feasible to implement and whether you're even asking for the correct thing. As always, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section or join my Discord server. And also, I have a C# course out. If you want to know programming as I do it, I highly recommend you go ahead and check it out. And with that, let's get into the video. Let's say I'm a junior, I joined a company, and I'm being asked to improve this endpoint, which takes some kind of document and stores it in this DB context. This is currently synchronous, and this is also a minimal API endpoint. So we're going to see how ChatGPT handles this. How can I improve this endpoint, right? Because I'm a noob. I don't know. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. It translated the endpoint into a controller. It added validation if the doc is null. It then made the stuff asynchronous, although I don't know about this add async. I'm not actually sure what that does, but we will let it off. So I'm gonna tell it that the handle function was meant to be a minimal API endpoint. Did I say handler or anything like that? Let's leave it at that. Okay, so it's generating me a full template with Swagger and everything. Let's say I personally don't use Swagger, so I don't know why it's doing it. And holy camole. Okay, so it has gone ahead and used a local function instead of a static function. We're gonna pardon it on that, but it has done some improvements on here. So let's go ahead and update the current state of this. We're now going to say that this action needs to be performed in a transaction. The requirements are that the action is performed in a transaction. Let's stop generation because I'm gonna fall asleep if it's gonna keep regenerating the whole application. Can you focus on just the endpoint and make it a static function rather than a local one? So this is a little bit more like advanced engineer speaking, because, you know, assume maybe a junior engineer doesn't know what a local versus a static function is. Maybe I just wanted to generate code a little bit faster. Okay, so it has done a couple of things. Let's see if I can, I'm fighting against the scrolly wheel there, but it is using an HTTP context right now. It's getting the required service, and then the doc is null and it's reading it from the body. So it has backtracked on some of its implementation, but it has added a transaction. Let's say that my boss has also said that this needs to handle the duplication, whatever that means. Okay, so a simple if statement check, that is okay. I'm pretty sure you are capable of basically coercing this condition to whatever you'd like, so make it deduplicate based on the following properties, etc. I'm pretty sure that will work. I'll say clean this up. Is that cleaning it up? Excuse me? I don't think out parameters is valid C# with the await keyword unless something has changed. Yeah, I don't think this is an actual function. Okay, so I don't think this is a legal C#. You cannot use the try pattern with the out keyword in an await context. That is basically part of the limitations of that. The rest is not cleaned up. Basically, what did I want for it to clean up as, well, somebody who would be reviewing this code? I would say, well, the resource doc, it can still be model bound and the DB context can still be dependency injected. So let's nudge it. I was told to use model binding and dependency injection in my endpoint. Okay, so from body and from services, I guess from services is not required and from body is not required. It doesn't, well, I'm gonna pardon that it doesn't know the exact syntax, but the rest of this is pretty all right. I mean, this is basic code. I think that's pretty good. How can I make the transaction logic reusable? That takes a delegate as a parameter representing the action to be used within a transaction. Here is an example. So the work that I want to perform in a transaction, it has placed it in a local function, and then we're supplying it to this other static function that, well, I mean, this could be an extension method, but that will be all right. So it's managed to isolate this logic in a static function. What you can then do further is essentially create middleware that will start the transaction, and you will place the next function somewhere over here. Because the DB context is a scoped service, any interaction with that DB context will essentially be tracked and will be part of that initial transaction. It's not rolling anything back though, but I'm assuming the using over here might handle that. Let's leave that at that. Let's try to see if I can move this to middleware. Can you move this transaction logic to middleware and check endpoint metadata transaction flag if it should be ran in a transaction? So this is a pretty advanced ask, pretty specific. I would not expect a junior to figure this out. Let's see what it comes back with. So it's getting the endpoint, which is good, and then it is getting the metadata of specific type. But yeah, it is creating a transaction, and let's see the transaction attribute. Yep, use middleware, and then with metadata. Okay, yep, that's good. Basically, I tried to give it a string to use as a metadata, but if it wants to use an attribute, I guess that is fine. Now at this point, this endpoint looks cleaner than, let's say, an endpoint that looks something like this. When I'm asking it to clean it up, it is not capable of, well, automatically just mustering up something of a solution like this, whereas an engineer like myself, obviously, would be able to come up with a solution that basically has a reusable transaction that basically slaps it on. I can tell it to a robot to write it out and then wait for like 1-2 minutes for it to type it out, but at that point I can actually write the code myself. And I mean, at this point, ChatGPT is doing amazing things, but I'm not convinced that it is actually capable of replacing any developers currently. You actually need to be a developer to tell it specific things or nudge it in specific directions for it to actually do valuable work. How can I further clean this up? Okay, so it wants to create a extension method to basically simplify this. Use a middleware transaction middleware, and basically it's going to create a class, a static class that is going to use transaction middleware. You've gone ahead and introduced a class. You've added lines of code to essentially have something like this. So I would not actually consider this change cleaner. Sure, if you're building a library and you're packaging up, perhaps you want to have an extension method like this, but in reality, this is not cleaner. This is just some people's preference, okay? Then what it's doing is it's adding a function, is duplicate async. So I think this is perhaps cleaning it up, although the logic of is duplicate async is not reusable, but I would give it that. Let's see what it says about what is faster, having a is duplicate async method or evaluating the query to is duplicate variable. There is no significance performance between however, is duplicate promotes cleaner code and better separation of concerns. It allows you to encapsulate the duplicate checking logic, making it easier to, okay, yep, encapsulates it. Well, if there is much to encapsulate, but this is, again, this is not a movable thing because it is a private function. Let's stop generating. Can you make the is duplicate logic reusable. So yeah, it would basically whack it on as an extension method on the resource DB context. Now what you're going to get anywhere where you're injecting your resource DB context, you're dragging along this essentially logic with you because it becomes available everywhere. I mean, the question is at this point, why would you put it on the extension methods rather than, well, the DB context itself? Let's give it one last go. How would I perform validation against an iValidator service outside of this endpoint? A validator service in a middleware. All right, let's see this. It's creating validation results. I think there is something in the standard library that already basically handles this or can basically contain all of this stuff. See the validator, so it implements this. You have some kind of validation logic. Yep, this is, well, pretty much mock logic. It flips the is valid to true. I guess it can reevaluate the count of errors. If the count of errors is 0, is valid can be true or not. So it's registering this resource doc validator. Again, we're then getting the endpoint. It again has a validation attribute, so we would have to manually mark the endpoint to be validatable. It is then using this try read from JSON async stuff, which I don't think actually exists, or it's actually not possible. I have to actually check myself because you can trust the machine, but yeah, you can't have async methods with ref or out params, okay? So this is 100% not possible what it's doing here. This would not compile, you'd have to go and fix it. You then have the wait, so what is this? So if we want validation and we're capable of getting the resource doc out, we would then try to validate this stuff, and if it's invalid, we write some error and we return. Otherwise, if we failed to decode it again, we write an error, and otherwise we proceed to next. One thing that I'm seeing here is a lot of nesting. So again, the code is growing right ways. Let's double check validation attribute. Yep, you can have something like this, absolutely. And then you'd grab this from the items. Can you rewrite this without using the validation attribute? So let me just grab the name because I can't spell validation. Okay, yeah, I think that's good. Again, initially, like, even the thought of needing a validation attribute, that wouldn't cross my mind, because if you understand code as data, you understand that you already have information about which document you have on yours, so you don't need to even prompt it. Or if I'm writing the code, I don't need to prompt myself to basically, I need to tag this. There is already a document there on the endpoint, so I can actually use that to infer which validation logic I need to trigger. Anyway, let's take a look at this validation middleware that has written. It is doing it based on the parameter type, so type of. We're getting some kind of resource doc parameter, and we're just checking it if it's not null. Again, the code is growing right ways. And the problem that we're seeing here is this is a very, very generic thing. This is checking a specific resource document. The validation should be able to work with any type of document. Reflection, okay. Type of iDocument. Okay, so it's checking if the parameter implements an iDocument, which is basically a marker that this thing should be validatable. We're then making an iValidator, which is okay. It can be generic. We can use an object. I mean, if we use an object, we avoid having to do this type generation, but this is all right. We get the validator. If the validator is a null, again, we have a lot of nesting over here, which I am personally not a fan of. We're then reading the document type. If the document type isn't null, it is then doing some crazy reflection over here to get the validation result. Again, if it just works based on an object without actually relying on the type system, I think the internal implementation for the iValidator service should just rely on casting, and that will just make things a little bit easier. But I guess this is still fine. It's pretty complicated code. So let's see this validation result that it has going on here. But I'll say that it's doing the job, and then it is still attaching the document. And then on here, yep, we would have to do casting. Let's see if it can. Don't use the items on the HTTP context. Okay, I think it did pretty well over here. We're basically using the validation service. I mean, well, not even actually a validation service. We are doing some kind of crazy malarkey. So if you have the HTTP context, you can have access to the service provider. So I don't know why it's injecting it here. But otherwise, it is, well, capable of refactoring from one solution into the other. It seems like it does need quite a bit of hand-holding, so I don't think, as amazing as this is, at the moment, this is not replacing junior developers because you need to still review the code. You need to basically be able to actually tell it what you want. And if you don't know what you want, well, then it's not going to give you what you want. And part of a programmer's job is to actually be able to extract what the heck do you actually want to implement. Are you aware of the authorization endpoint from auth 2.1? I'm gonna stop generating here because I don't really care about the explanation. What I really care about it is, can it take my job and implement the authorization endpoint for me, even though that it's aware it hasn't been changed? In C#. So far this is going terribly wrong, but I'm gonna let it generate till the end and we're gonna see if we can actually force it to give us something good. Okay, computer has had enough of coding for today. Let's generate again. This time it's asking me to install the validation package, and again we're going straight to startup CS. So this is very wrong. I'm just going to stop it here because as we know it, the authorization endpoint is the thing which is going to be generating the authorization grant based on client. So let's actually try to nudge it in this direction. I want just the authorization endpoint of the auth 2.0 spec, which can process authorization code flow. Okay, let's see what it gives us. Apparently you need OpenID Connect before you can implement the authorization endpoint. Okay, maybe we're getting there. And actually I got excited for no reason. So this will just trigger the authentication for this authentication schema that we have registered here. So this will actually trigger a redirect to the authorization endpoint, which I actually want the implementation for. So let's again try to direct it one last time. The authorize endpoint will redirect to authorization endpoint of the OIDC server. What I'm asking for is the implementation of that authorization endpoint because I am building an OIDC server. Yes. Identity server 4. That is outdated, brother. Okay, let's stop it right here because I don't want to use identity server 4. I don't want to use identity server 4. And that is actually pretty good. And that looks all right, although all of the comments, there's basically no implementation. Everything is pretty much a skeleton. Let's see if we can try force it to implement something. Can you implement validation according to the specification? Replace any abstractions with an interface. Not quite what I had in mind, but okay. It was really good at generating the template. I think maybe it misunderstood me when I asked it for the implementation of the validation. So let's try to nudge it towards the actual authorization code implementation. Can you implement the code generation where the code is a product of the request arguments, comma, hashed using the data protection API and stored in the database using EF-core as soon as it's created. Not a bad start as always. Not bad, sure. I mean, for the development experience of telling something to a computer and then waiting for it to actually churn it out, I mean, it's boring. I would rather sit down and write the code myself and then go find this stuff out. Am I doing something correctly? Write a test, etc. rather than sit here and just wait for it to do its thing. Not bad, pretty simple. It's just fucking stopped. Can you focus on the authorization endpoint and skip all the setup stuff? There is no confusion, just talk less. Okay, so it managed to amazingly generate a hard to guess value and store it in a database. Now validate query parameters based on client configuration in the database. Focus on the service and the endpoint. Okay, so what has it generated over here? A function, redirect URI in scoped, allowed scopes allowed redirect URIs. Okay, so there are a couple of tables over here. It is missing them from the DB context. So, I mean, these tables aren't configured, but we will pardon it. It has not included these comparisons in the query itself. I don't know if is it just not aware that it can do it, but I am pretty sure a developer would be able to write this a little bit better. Otherwise, that's all right. Let's check the endpoint. Again, check the code client. If client is equal null, invalid client configuration. I don't think these errors are spec compliant, but we will let it off. And again, it seems to be cutting off for me. I'm going to stop here. I think it's pretty apparent that if you're a developer and you don't know auth specification, you're actually going to struggle to relay that auth specification idea to ChatGPT in order for it to implement correctly. Because at the moment, it is very hard to basically just say, generate me a service which implements the auth specification. You have to actually know how the authorization endpoint is going to work in order to tell ChatGPT how to implement it. But at that point, you might as well write the code yourself. And there we have it. Hopefully you can see that ChatGPT is not replacing programmers. Whatever skills you had before ChatGPT's release and after and many years into the future, they're still going to be valuable. If you're a junior starting out, don't get discouraged. The ability to problem solve that you learn from programming is far more valuable than you just being able to write out whatever code ChatGPT just knows how to write. With that, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. A very, very big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. There is no source code that you can purchase here, but if you would like to support me on Patreon, please do. As always, thank you for watching and see you later.